The notification chimed, soft, almost apologetic in the heavy silence of the living room, but it landed like a hammer blow on Sarah's chest. If this gentle story brought even a tiny smile or calm to your heart, would you consider subscribing? It helps me keep sharing these soft moments, and for you, and for anyone who needs peace tonight. 3 years, 1,000 hollow nights. Sarah stared at the phone screen, the glow the only light in the room except for the cold blue flicker from the muted TV. Rain lashed against the bay window, turning the familiar suburban street into a smeared watercolor of gray and sodium orange. It was late October, the kind of damp chill that seeped through wool socks and settled deep in the bones, carrying the scent of wet earth, decaying leaves, and the faint, distant tang of wood smoke someone hadn't quite banked right. The heater hummed, fighting a losing battle. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the loose drainpipe by the garage, a familiar mournful sound that had become part of the soundtrack of their loss. Sarah was curled into the corner of the worn corduroy sofa, knees drawn up, a half-forgotten mug of lukewarm tea cradled in hands that felt perpetually cold. She wasn't really watching the TV. Her gaze drifted past the flickering images, past the rain-streaked glass, landing on the empty space beneath the bookshelf. That's where the old threadbare fleece blanket used to be, perpetually dented by a small warm weight. The absence wasn't just visual. It was a physical pressure, a constant low ache just below her sternum. 3 years hadn't scabbed it over, just made the edges feel more numb, more permanent. Her husband, Mark, sat in his armchair, pretending to read a magazine, the pages turning too slowly, his eyes not really moving across the print. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper in the dim light, etched by the same relentless worry and the quiet erosion of hope. Their daughter, Chloe, now 10 and trying so hard to be grown up, had gone to bed an hour ago, but Sarah knew she wasn't asleep. She could picture her lying there clutching the small stuffed ginger cat she'd insisted on keeping on her pillow, long after she'd outgrown other toys. The notification had been from the local animal shelter's Facebook page. Sarah followed, it a ritual of quiet torture she couldn't break. Hope was a dangerous thing, a flickering candle in a drafty room, but snuffing it out completely felt like a betrayal. She scrolled through the usual posts, urgent pleas for fosters, lost dogs, kittens needing homes. Her thumb moved mechanically, the images blurring, a blur of hopeful eyes and pleading captions. Then, she stopped. Her breath hitched, sharp and sudden in the quiet room. Mark's head snapped up. "Sarah?" His voice was rough with unused sleep and concern. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her fingers trembled as she zoomed in on the photo. It was a cat, a ginger cat, found wandering near the drive-thru of the McDonald's, on Elm Street 2 towns over, scraggly thin, one ear slightly ragged at the tip. But the eyes, oh God, the eyes. Deep green, flecked with gold, holding an expression that wasn't just fear, it was a profound, weary confusion. And the way it held its head, slightly tilted, as if perpetually listening for a sound only it could hear. Just like, "Mark," she whispered, the sound barely escaping her constricted throat. She thrust the phone towards him, her hand shaking so badly the image vibrated. "Look." Mark leaned forward, squinting. He took the phone, his own hand steady but his knuckles white. He stared, silence stretched thick and heavy, broken only by the drumming rain and the heater's futile hum. Sarah watched his face, saw the disbelief warring with a dawning, terrifying spark. He zoomed in, his thumb tracing the edge of the screen. Hovering, over the cat's face, then down its flank, he stopped, swallowed hard. The patch," he rasped, his voice thick. "On his left hind leg, that little white smudge, like a thumbprint." Sarah's vision blurred. She knew that patch, knew it like she knew the pattern of freckles on Chloe's nose. Marmalade, their marmalade. He'd had that since he was a kitten, a tiny anomaly in his otherwise vibrant orange fur. A unique identifier they'd joked about. His little paint spill, Chloe used to call it. The shelter post listed him as found stray male ginger, approx 5 to 7 years, very timid. Marmalade would be 7 now, found near a McDonald's. He'd hated car rides, hated unfamiliar places. How? How had he ended up 20 miles away? 3 years, wandering, scavenging, surviving. It can't be. Mark breathed, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He was looking at the photo, again then at Sarah, his eyes wide with a terrifying mix of hope and dread. Sarah, after all this time? The odds. Sarah felt the world tilt. The familiar numbness cracked, replaced by a surge of something raw and terrifyingly alive. It wasn't just the visual match, it was the feel of the creature in that poorly lit shelter photo, the way it seemed to huddle into itself, radiating a loneliness that echoed her own. The tilt of the head, Marmalade had always done that when he heard the garage door open waiting for them. The ragged ear, a new wound, a story of survival they didn't know. The white patch, undeniable. Chloe appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, her stuffed ginger cat dangling from one hand. Mommy? Daddy? What's wrong? She took in their frozen postures, the intensity crackling between them. Her gaze landed on the phone in Mark's hand. She patted closer, her bare feet silent on the rug. She peered at the screen. For a moment, she just blinked. Then a small gasp escaped her. Her hand flew to her mouth. Marmee? The name, the childhood nickname hung in the air, fragile as a soap bubble. Is that Marmee? Her voice was a tiny, hopeful thing, cracking on the last syllable. Sarah looked from her daughter's wide, disbelieving eyes to Mark's stunned face, then back to the pixelated image of the wary ginger cat staring out from a metal cage. The rain lashed harder against the window. The heater kicked on with a louder groan. The ache beneath her sternum flared, hot and urgent, no longer numb but screaming. 3 years of searching, of posters fading in the rain, of dead ends and false alarms, of quietly mourning a creature whose absence had left a marmalade-shaped hole in their lives. It all condensed into this single, trembling moment staring at a fast food restaurant stray on a social media feed. The impossible suddenly felt terrifyingly, heart-stoppingly possible. The shelter closed in an hour. The post was already 6 hours old. Comments were starting to pile up beneath the photo. Aw, poor baby. Hope he finds a home. Such a sweet face. Mark met Sarah's gaze. The unspoken question hung between them, charged with 3 years of grief and a fragile, terrifying hope. The silence stretched, thick with the drumming rain, the frantic hammering of Sarah's own heart, and the ghost of a purr that hadn't been heard in this house for far too long. Something immense and fragile and potentially shattering, had just clicked into place in the cold rain-lashed gloom of their living room. The search wasn't over. It had just taken the most unexpected, impossible turn. The quiet dread of hoping was back, sharper than ever, a knife poised over their carefully constructed acceptance. They had to move. Now, before the flicker of hope, fragile as a candle flame in this downpour, was blown out forever. The journey back, or the final devastating confirmation, was just a car ride away. The story wasn't ending tonight. It was finally, agonizingly, beginning again. The drive to the shelter was a blur of rain-slicked asphalt and the frantic thrumming of Sarah's own pulse in her ears. 20 miles. It felt like crossing a continent. Mark drove, his knuckles pale, on the steering wheel, the wipers slapping furiously against the torrential downpour that turned headlights into smeared halos and street signs into ghostly suggestions. Chloe sat rigid in the back seat, her stuffed ginger cat clutched so tightly its fabric seemed strained, her small face pressed against the cold window, eyes wide and unblinking, scanning every shadowed alleyway, every rain-lashed bush, as if Marmalade might materialize out of the storm. The heater blasted, but a deep, pervasive cold had settled into Sarah's bones, a cold born of 3 years of hollowed-out hope and the terrifying fragility of this moment. The scent of wet upholstery and Chloe's strawberry shampoo mingled, with the metallic tang of tension. Every bump in the road jolted through Sarah, a physical echo of the fear vibrating inside her. What if it's not him? What if it is, and he's broken? What if he doesn't remember? The questions were a swarm of wasps trapped behind her ribs. Mark reached across the console, his hand finding hers. His palm was damp, his grip almost painfully tight. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The shared dread, the shared, desperate yearning was a living thing in the cramped space of the car. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick with unspoken prayers and the remembered ghost of a purr that used to rumble contentedly on Sarah's lap during car rides to the vet. Rides Marmalade had always hated, burying his face in her elbow, his little body trembling. The memory was a fresh wound. How much terror had he endured in 3 years? How many miles had those small paws walked? The McDonald's, the image of him, thin and ragged, lurking near the garish lights and the smell of frying grease, a creature of quiet woods and sun-warmed decks reduced to scavenging discarded fries. It made Sarah feel physically ill. Chloe sniffled softly in the back seat. Sarah squeezed Mark's hand back, a silent anchor in the storm of their shared anxiety. The county animal shelter sat on the industrial edge of town, a low utilitarian building washed in the harsh, unforgiving glare of floodlights that turned the relentless rain into silver needles. The parking lot was nearly empty, puddled and desolate. The sign, flickering slightly, read, "Closing soon." Sarah's heart hammered against her sternum like a trapped bird. Too late. We're too late. Panic clawed at her throat. Mark killed the engine, the sudden silence a shock. The only sounds were the drumming rain and the distant, mournful chorus of barking dogs from inside. "Stay here, sweetheart," Mark said, his voice rough, turning to Chloe. "Just for a minute. Let Mom and Dad go in first, okay?" Chloe's lower lip trembled, but she nodded mutely, her eyes huge and terrified in the dashboard glow. She hugged her stuffed cat tighter, a silent sentinel. Sarah fumbled with her seatbelt, her fingers numb and clumsy. They ran through the downpour, shoulders hunched against the cold lash of it, their footsteps splashing loudly in the puddles. The automatic doors hissed open, releasing a wave of sound and smell that hit Sarah like a physical blow. Barking, yelping, frantic scratching against metal, a cacophony of canine distress. Underlying it all was the sharp, astringent smell of industrial cleaner, urine, damp fur, and fear. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed relentlessly, casting a sickly greenish pall over everything. A young woman with tired eyes sat behind a high counter, scrolling on her phone. She looked up as they rushed in, dripping water onto the linoleum floor. "Help you?" she asked, her tone flat, devoid of expectation. She'd seen hundreds of hopeful, desperate faces. "The cat," Sarah gasped, breathless, rainwater dripping from her hair into her eyes. "The ginger cat. Found near McDonald's. You posted him tonight? On Facebook?" Recognition flickered in the woman's eyes. "Oh, yeah, stray ginger. Back. In isolation, he's skittish. Real skittish. We just scanned him, no chip." She pushed a clipboard across the counter. "Sign in. I'll get Mandy." She brought him in. Sarah's hand shook violently as she scrawled her name, the pen skittering, on the damp paper. No chip. They'd had him chipped. Had it migrated? Failed? Or was this not Marmalade? The doubt was a cold knife twisting. Mark signed next to her, his signature a jagged line. A moment later, a woman in a dark green shelter uniform emerged, from a door marked staff only. Mandy. She looked young, early 20s, with kind eyes that held a deep weariness. "You hear about the ginger?" Mandy asked, wiping her hands on a towel. Her gaze flickered over them, taking in their soaked clothes, their pale, strained faces. "He's a mess. Thin. Dehydrated. Got a nasty bite on that ear, healed rough. Won't let anyone near him. Hisses, spits, flattens himself into the corner, like he's trying to disappear into the wall." Sarah's heart sank. Marmalade had never been aggressive. Anxious, yes. Hated strangers, absolutely. But never hostile. Can we see him?" The question came out barely a whisper. Mandy hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but go slow. Real slow. He's terrified. And keep your voices down. This way." She led them down a narrow corridor lined with kennels. The barking intensified, a wall of sound that vibrated in Sarah's teeth. Dogs lunged at the bars as they passed, hopeful eyes, desperate whines, paws scrabbling on concrete. The smell intensified, desperation, confinement, the faint metallic tang of fear sweat. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on Mandy's back, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, trying to breathe through the suffocating atmosphere and the crushing weight of potential disappointment. Mark walked beside her, a solid, silent presence radiating tension. They turned a corner into a quieter section. Isolation, Mandy said softly. For new intakes or sick animals, less stress. She stopped outside a door with a small, reinforced window. He's in here. Don't open the door all the way, just peek. Sarah stepped forward first. Her legs felt like water. She leaned towards the small window, her breath fogging the cold glass. The room inside was small, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb. Concrete floor, a metal sink, a drain. And in the farthest corner, tucked behind a small plastic carrier placed on its side like a makeshift cave, was a huddled shape. Orange fur, matted, dirty, wet in patches. He was curled tightly into himself, facing the wall, his back a tense, trembling curve. His head was tucked low, almost invisible. One ragged ear, the tip missing, twitched slightly. He looked impossibly small. Smaller than Sarah remembered. Broken. A discarded scrap of fur. Then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, the head lifted. Just a fraction. One green eye, wide and unblinking, swiveled towards the window. It wasn't the warm, gold-flecked green of Marmalade's lazy afternoon gaze. This was a wild, feral green, shot through with pure, undiluted terror. It locked onto Sarah's face through the glass. Sarah froze. The world narrowed to that single, terrified eye. The eye of a creature pushed beyond endurance. It held no recognition. Only the primal fear of a trapped animal. Not him. It's not him. The thought was a crushing weight. The white patch. She couldn't see his hind leg. He was curled too tightly. The tilt of the head. It was gone, replaced by a rigid posture of pure defense. Disappointment, cold and final, washed over her, followed by a wave of profound grief, not just for Marmalade, but for this broken creature before her. She started to turn away, her vision blurring. A sound stopped her. Not a hiss. Not a growl. A tiny choked mew. It was barely audible over the distant barking, a sound so small, so utterly defeated it shattered something inside Sarah. It wasn't Marmalade's confident chirp or his demanding meow for dinner. This was the sound of a soul utterly lost. And yet, the pitch of it. That faint questioning lilt at the end. Her breath caught. Marmalade had always ended his little "where are you" calls with that same soft upward inflection. The cat slowly, painstakingly, uncurled a fraction more. He shifted his weight, turning his head slightly towards the window. The movement revealed his left hind leg stretched out just a little. There, just above the hock, a small, distinct, irregular smudge of pure white fur against the vibrant orange. Like a thumbprint, dabbed in paint, his little paint spill. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. Marmalade. It was him. The confirmation wasn't a joyful shout. It was a punch to the gut, stealing her breath. Seeing the proof, seeing him like this, diminished, terrified, a ghost of the plump, confident cat who used to sprawl across their sun-warmed deck, was almost more than she could bear. The 3 years collapsed in on her. A crushing weight of imagined horrors, freezing nights, hungry days, the scrape of claws on pavement, the roar of traffic, the loneliness echoing her own, the ragged ear, a fight, a cruel hand, the matted fur. Had anyone touched him kindly since he vanished? The terror in his eyes. Had he given up on them ever finding him? Mark leaned in beside her, his shoulder pressing against hers. She felt the sharp intake of his breath. "The patch," he whispered, his voice thick. "Sarah, it's him." There was no triumph in his tone. Only shared devastation, shared recognition of the profound damage done. Marmalade's eye remained fixed on Sarah. The terror was still there, a deep pulsing current. But within it, as she stared back, refusing to look away, refusing to let her own tears fall yet, she saw something else flicker. Not recognition, not yet, but a shift. A tiny, almost imperceptible lessening of the absolute panic, a hesitation, as if her steady gaze, her familiar silhouette despite the years, was hitting some deep buried chord. His body remained coiled, ready to bolt, but the frantic trembling in his shoulders seemed to ease, just a fraction. He blinked, slowly. Once. It wasn't a slow blink of affection. Not yet. It was the blink of an exhausted creature momentarily lowering its guard, too weary to sustain absolute terror. But in the sterile, fear-soaked air of the isolation room, in the shadow of 3 years of loss, that single, slow blink felt like the first fragile thread thrown across an abyss. He didn't hiss. He didn't flatten his ears further. He just looked and blinked and made that tiny loss sound again. Mandy spoke softly beside them. He hasn't done that since he got here. Looked at anyone directly, I mean. Or made that sound. He just hid and hissed. She sounded surprised, a note of cautious wonder in her weary voice. You know him? He's ours, Sarah managed, the words scraping her throat raw. His name is Marmalade. He's been missing. She couldn't finish. 3 years. The words choked her. Mandy's eyes widened. Oh my God. The posters years ago, Ginger Cat Marmalade, I think I remember seeing those. She looked back at the huddled cat with new understanding, her professional detachment softening. Oh, buddy, she murmured. You made it home. The bureaucratic process that followed felt surreal, happening in a strange bubble detached from the raw emotion vibrating in the isolation room doorway. Paperwork. Proof of ownership. Sarah frantically scrolled through her phone, hands shaking, pulling up ancient vet records, photos of Marmalade sprawled on their rug, curled on Chloe's bed, his eyes bright, his fur gleaming. The shelter manager, a brisk but not unkind woman, reviewed everything. There were fees, an intake fee, a holding fee. Sarah signed forms without reading them, her eyes constantly darting back to the small window. Mark handled the payment, his movements efficient but his face pale, etched with strain. Bringing Chloe in was agony. The little girl vibrated with barely contained hope and terror. When Mandy carefully opened the isolation room door just a crack, ushering them into the small, stark space, the smell hit Sarah anew. Antiseptic, fear and the faint, musky scent of cat, a scent she'd know anywhere buried under layers of dirt and stress. Marmalade instantly recoiled, pressing himself deeper into the corner behind the carrier, his eyes wide saucers of panic, a low, guttural growl starting deep in his chest. Chloe let out a small whimper, clutching her stuffed cat. Chloe, baby, stay back, Sarah whispered, putting an arm out to gently hold her daughter behind her. He's scared. He doesn't understand yet. Her own heart was pounding against her ribs. Seeing him up close without the barrier of glass was overwhelming. The matted fur, the visible ribs under his thin coat, the haunted look in his eyes, it was Marmalade, yet it wasn't. The vibrant, slightly aloof king of their household was reduced to this trembling shadow. The white patch was undeniable, a beacon of his identity amidst the ruin. But the spirit, where was it? Sarah slowly sank to her knees on the cold, concrete floor, several feet away from his hiding spot. Mark knelt beside her. Chloe hovered behind them, trying to peek around Sarah's shoulder. Sarah kept her movements deliberate, telegraphing her intentions. She didn't reach out. She didn't call his name loudly. She simply sat, and breathed, and looked at him, not with the intensity of before, but with a soft, steady gaze she hoped conveyed safety. I'm here. I see you. I'm not leaving. Minutes ticked by, measured in the frantic drumming of Sarah's pulse and the distant, muffled barking. The low growl subsided, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Marmalade didn't retreat further, but he didn't relax, either. His gaze darted between the three humans, wary, calculating. Sarah noticed tiny details, the way his whiskers twitched minutely, sampling the air, the slight tremor in his front paw where it pressed against the floor, the faint rasp in his breathing. Have you ever had an animal wait for you even when you didn't ask them to? The question floated unbidden in Sarah's mind. Had Marmalade waited? Somewhere, in the cold and the dark, had some part of him held onto the memory of warmth, of food of them? Or had he simply survived the memory buried under layers of trauma? Then Sarah did the only thing that felt right. She started talking. Softly. Not to him directly, not at first. Just talking. To Mark about the rain. To Chloe about how brave she was being. Nonsense, really. Filling the terrifying silence with the mundane cadence of her voice. The voice he'd heard every day of his life until 3 years ago. She talked about needing to buy milk. About the loose drain pipe at home. About how the heater always groaned like that on cold nights. Her voice, though trembling slightly, was low, rhythmic, familiar. Mark picked up the thread, his deeper voice adding a counterpoint. He mentioned fixing the drain pipe this weekend, asked Chloe if she wanted pancakes tomorrow, rambled about work, normal things, safe things. Chloe, emboldened by their calm, whispered from behind Sarah, "Hi, Marmy." The childhood nickname, spoken so softly. Marmalade flinched at the sound, but didn't growl. His intense stare remained fixed, but the rigid tension in his shoulders seemed to lessen incrementally. His gaze shifted, focusing more intently on Sarah's face as she spoke. He blinked again. Another slow blink. Longer this time. His ears, which had been pinned flat back slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to rotate forward. Just a fraction. Just enough to lose the razor-sharp edge of defensive fury. He shifted his weight, uncurled a little more. His nose twitched furiously, sniffing the air flowing towards him from where they knelt. Was he catching their scent? Underneath the shelter smells, the fear. Could he detect the faint, familiar traces of their laundry detergent? Sarah's hand lotion, the unique scent of home that lingered on their clothes despite the rain? His gaze dropped from Sarah's face to her hands resting loosely in her lap. He stared at them. Then, with agonizing slowness, he stretched one thin, trembling foreleg out from his hiding spot. Not far. Just an inch. Then another. His claws, overgrown and slightly ragged, tapped faintly on the concrete. Tap, tap. The sound was minuscule, almost lost, but in the quiet room, it echoed. He was testing the space. Testing them. Sarah held her breath. Mark stopped talking. Chloe was utterly still. The only sound was Marmalade's faint, raspy breathing and the tiny tap, tap of his claws. He stretched further. His head emerged, fully from behind the carrier. He was looking directly at Sarah's hands now. His body was still low to the ground, ready to spring back, but the intense fear in his eyes was now mingled with something else, a profound, exhausted curiosity, a desperate, tentative hope that mirrored their own. He took one more infinitesimal step forward, then another. He was now fully out of his corner, though still several feet away, a small, vulnerable island of orange in the gray concrete expanse. He stopped, looked directly into Sarah's eyes, held her gaze, and then he did something that stopped Sarah's heart. He lifted his head, just a little, and tilted it. That familiar questioning tilt to the left. Exactly as he used to do when he heard the garage door open, waiting, listening, hoping. 3 years of wandering, of hunger and fear and cold, and the instinct, the memory, was still there, buried deep, battered but not extinguished. The tilt was hesitant, fragile, but undeniably his. It wasn't trust yet. Not fully. It was the barest beginning of a bridge being rebuilt, plank by fragile plank, across an ocean of time and trauma. The sheer vulnerability of that gesture, the echo of his old self breaking through the layers of survival, was almost more than Sarah could bear. A single tear escaped, tracing a hot path down her cold cheek. She didn't move. She didn't dare break the spell. She just looked back at him, her own silent promise in her eyes. I see you. I remember. I'm here. The silence stretched, thick and sacred. The fear hadn't vanished. The damage was evident. The road back would be long, paved with patience and setbacks. But in that sterile, cold room smelling of disinfectant and despair, something monumental had shifted. The lost cat had been found. And now, against all odds, the first tremulous thread of the bond that had been severed 3 years ago had just been tentatively, miraculously, picked up again. The trembling creature before them wasn't just a stray. He was Marmalade, and he was starting to remember the sound of home. The surprise wasn't that he was there. The surprise, the emotionally charged gift that left them breathless, was that flicker of recognition, that fragile tilt of the head, proving that somewhere, beneath the scars and the terror, their Marmalade was still alive. The journey back had truly agonizingly begun. Bringing Marmalade home was like carrying a ghost made of thorns and brittle bone. The carrier, alone from the shelter, felt unnervingly light. Inside, he was a silent, shivering statue, pressed against the back grate, his wide, haunted eyes reflecting the passing streetlights like fractured emeralds in the dark. Sarah held the carrier on her lap in the back seat. Chloe pressed close beside her, both their hands resting lightly on the plastic, radiating warmth and whispered reassurances that felt pitifully inadequate against the fortress of terror he'd built. Mark drove slower than usual, navigating the rain-slicked streets with exaggerated care, as if jostling the car might shatter the fragile creature within. The scent of damp fur, antiseptic, and deep primal fear filled the car, overlaying the familiar smells of home, old upholstery, Chloe's forgotten granola bar wrapper, the pine air freshener dangling from the mirror. The heater's drone was the only sound besides the swish of tires and the frantic hammering of 3 human hearts. Arriving home felt surreal. The house, once echoing with his absence, now felt charged with a new, fragile presence. They set the carrier down gently in the living room, near the spot under the bookshelf where his blanket used to be. A space Sarah had cleared earlier, replacing it with a soft, new fleece and a shallow dish of water. They opened the carrier door wide and retreated to the kitchen doorway, giving him space. Minutes bled into an hour. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He simply crouched, a compact ball of orange tension, his gaze fixed on the open carrier door like it was the only known exit from a terrifying world. The familiar surroundings, the corduroy sofa, the flickering TV screen now dark, the pattern of the rug, seemed to hold no meaning for him. It was just another strange, potentially dangerous enclosure. Do you think animals understand time? The question whispered in Sarah's mind, watching him. Did 3 years feel like an eternity in his world? Was this house, once his kingdom, now just another confusing stop in a long, terrifying journey? The hopeful head tilt at the shelter felt like a cruel mirage now, swallowed by the overwhelming reality of his trauma. It took the quiet of deep night for him to finally, tentatively emerge. Sarah, unable to sleep, sat on the bottom stair in the darkened hallway, wrapped in a blanket, listening. She heard it first, the faintest scrape of claws on the carrier, floor, then silence. Then the softest thump as he jumped down onto the rug. Her breath caught. She stayed perfectly still, hidden in shadow. She heard the cautious sniffing, the tentative steps, the pauses that stretched for minutes. He wasn't exploring, he was mapping escape routes, testing shadows, his body low, his movements fluid but charged with electric tension. He bypassed the new fleece bed entirely. He bypassed the water dish. He moved like smoke along the edges of the room, disappearing, behind the sofa, reappearing near the window, then vanishing again into the deeper darkness of the dining room. Sarah finally retreated to bed, her heart aching, leaving him to navigate the terrifying familiarity of his old territory alone. The days that followed were a slow, painstaking dance. Marmalade existed in the periphery, a silent, watchful shadow. He ate, but only at night when the house was utterly still and dark, scavenging the kibble Sarah left near the back door like a feral creature. He drank thirstily from the bathroom faucet, dripping into the sink, a habit he'd never had before. He used the litter box meticulously tucked away in the laundry room, but he'd bolt like lightning if anyone came near while he was in there. The slightest sound, a dropped spoon, Chloe's laugh too loud, the rumble of the garage door opening, sent him scrambling for cover, vanishing into impossible gaps behind furniture or under beds, his eyes wide discs of panic. Sarah marked progress in microscopic increments. The distance he'd tolerate before fleeing shrank by inches. He began to watch them from under the dining table, his gaze less purely feral, more wary observation. Once, when Sarah sat very still on the floor, reading engrossed in her book, she felt rather than saw him. She glanced up slowly. He was sitting just inside the doorway to the living room, barely 5 feet away, utterly still, watching her. Not cowering, just watching. His green eyes held a complex mix, residual fear, profound exhaustion, and a dawning, hesitant curiosity. He held her gaze for a full 10 seconds before melting soundlessly back into the hallway shadows. It was a victory measured in heartbeats. He began to find hiding spots that weren't just about concealment, but seemed chosen for specific reasons. The deep, dark space behind the heavy drapes in the rarely used formal living room became a favorite. But his most perplexing refuge was a tiny gap between the bulky old dryer and the wall in the laundry room. It was dusty, cramped, and offered no view, yet he'd squeeze himself back there for hours, a silent orange sentinel facing the wall, his back to the room. It wasn't fear of them specifically in those moments. It was a profound need to be enclosed, protected on all sides, hidden from the overwhelming openness of the world. Sarah would find him there, only the tip of his tail or a flick of an ear visible, radiating a deep, immovable melancholy. Why there? She'd wonder. What does that tight, dark space represent now? Safety, the memory of a drainpipe, a dumpster. The biggest shift, the most bewildering behavior centered around the garage door. Not the sound of it opening, that still terrified him, but the door itself. Several times a day, when he felt the house was quiet enough, Marmalade would emerge from wherever he was hiding and pad silently down the hallway to the door leading into the garage. He wouldn't scratch or meow. He'd sit directly in front of it, perfectly still, his nose almost touching the wood grain. And he'd stare, intently, unblinkingly, as if willing it to open or perhaps deciphering some hidden message in its painted surface. He'd sit like that for long stretches, sometimes letting out a soft, questioning chirp, the same sound he'd made as a kitten waiting for someone to come home. It was heartbreaking. It was as if the door represented the barrier between the terrifying now and the lost then, the place where the world had swallowed him whole 3 years ago. Was he waiting for it to open and reveal the past? Or was he trying to understand how it had led him to the cold, greasy chaos of a McDonald's drive-thru? One rainy afternoon, Sarah found him there again. She knelt slowly on the floor several feet away, respecting his space. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, her voice soft as the rain tapping the window. "What do you see, huh?" He didn't startle. He didn't even look at her. His entire focus remained laser-locked on the door. His tail twitched once, the very tip. A tiny sigh escaped him, a sound of such profound, weary confusion it brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? He was waiting. Not for food, not for a stroke. He was waiting for an answer, for a door to make sense again. The mystery of where he'd been, the unspoken trauma etched into his ragged ear and skittish soul, seemed concentrated in that silent vigil at the garage door. Chloe was his bravest advocate. She understood quiet, like he did. She'd sit on the floor near his hiding spots, reading her books aloud in a soft, steady monotone or simply coloring, radiating calm. She'd leave little offerings near the places he frequented. A smooth stone she'd found, a feather, a piece of her string. Cheese. He never took them while she was there, but sometimes Sarah would find the cheese gone. The stone nudged slightly. Progress measured in stolen cheese in the shrinking radius of fear. Then came the invitation. Chloe's 11th birthday party, a week away, 10 girls, noise, chaos, cupcakes dropped, music playing, shrieks of laughter echoing through the house. The thought sent a cold wave of dread through Sarah. Marmalade had barely tolerated the quiet rhythms of their fractured household. The controlled chaos of a children's party felt like a potential disaster, a trigger that could shatter the fragile trust they were painstakingly building. Could they confine him to a single room? Would he panic, hurt himself trying to escape? Would the stress set back his recovery irreparably? Sarah broached the subject with Mark one night as they lay in bed, listening to the faint sounds of Marmalade moving cautiously somewhere downstairs. "We could ask Mrs. Henderson next door to take him for the afternoon," Mark suggested, his voice heavy with doubt. Mrs. Henderson had 3 yappy terriers. "He'd be terrified," Sarah whispered. "A strange house, strange smells, after everything. It might be worse. Maybe he'll just hide, like he does now," Mark offered weakly. Sarah thought of the tiny gap behind the dryer. Would he retreat there and simply endure hours of terrifying noise vibrating through the walls? Would he feel betrayed? The party felt like an encroaching storm, threatening the delicate ecosystem of safety they were trying to rebuild. The emotional stakes, already high, suddenly felt vertiginous. Marmalade's fragile progress wasn't just about comfort anymore. It felt like survival. Pushing him too far, too fast, could break something essential. The next morning, Sarah found him at the garage door again. This time, instead of sitting, he was standing, his front paws placed delicately on the wood, his nose pressed against the crack at the bottom. He was sniffing deeply, intently. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and cool. Was he smelling the damp concrete of the garage? The oil stain on the floor? The ghost scent of his own past comings and goings? He let out a soft, plaintive meow, a sound utterly different from the lost mew at the shelter or the wary chirps. This was a sound of pure longing. It echoed in the quiet hallway, a lonely, unanswered call. Later that day, Sarah tried something. While Marmalade was hidden behind the living room drapes, she very quietly unlocked the garage door from the kitchen side and opened it just a crack, maybe 2 inches. Just enough to let in the cool, damp air and the familiar garage smells. Concrete, dust, the faint tang of gasoline from Mark's lawnmower. She didn't go in. She left it ajar and retreated to the kitchen, pretending to wash dishes. She heard the soft pad-pad of his approach long before she saw him. He emerged from the living room doorway, his body low, ears swiveling, every sense on high alert. He froze when he saw the open crack. His eyes widened, not with panic this time, but with an intense, almost feverish focus. He crept forward, silent as a shadow, until he was right at the threshold. He sniffed the air flowing through the gap, his nostrils flaring. He peered into the dimness beyond. He didn't try to go through. He didn't bolt. He just investigated. He sat down right there in the open doorway. His tail curled around his paws and stared into the garage. He stayed that way for nearly an hour, a silent, watchful guardian at the threshold of memory, before finally retreating back into the house, seeming not relaxed, but contemplative. The mystery deepened. What drew him to this space? Was it a memory of safety, or the starting point of his nightmare? The party loomed. Sarah felt the pressure like a physical weight. Chloe was excited, bubbling over with plans for games and decorations, blissfully unaware of the silent storm brewing around their fragile cat. Sarah watched Marmalade that evening. He ate a little kibble earlier than usual, while they were still moving around the kitchen making dinner. He sat near the living room doorway while they ate, watching them, his posture less rigid. He even ventured closer to Chloe as she sat on the rug building a Lego castle, stopping about 3 feet away, watching her hands move with detached curiosity before wandering off. Small steps, hopeful steps. But were they enough? 2 nights before the party, the shift happened. It was late. The house was dark and quiet. Sarah, reading in bed, heard a sound that made her put her book down instantly. It wasn't a cry of fear. It wasn't a tentative chirp. It was a low, rumbling vibration, almost inaudible at first, then growing slightly stronger. A purr, faint, raspy, interrupted by little hitches like an engine trying to turn over after years of disuse. But undeniably a purr. Her heart leaped. She slipped out of bed and crept silently to the bedroom door, peering down the dark hallway. A sliver of moonlight fell through the living room window, illuminating the new fleece bed under the bookshelf. Marmalade was there, curled tightly but on the bed, not just near it, on it. His head was tucked into his paws, his eyes closed. The purr was emanating from him, a fragile, thrumming counterpoint to the silence. He wasn't just tolerating the bed. He was seeking its comfort. Sarah watched, tears welling silently, afraid to breathe, afraid to shatter the moment. It was the first time he'd chosen comfort over concealment since coming home, a small seismic shift in his broken world. Hope, fierce and tender, bloomed in Sarah's chest. Maybe, just maybe. The next day, the storm clouds of the party seemed less ominous. Marmalade was still skittish, still spending hours in his tight spaces or staring at the garage door, but the purr felt like a promise. Sarah decided on a plan. They would set up the basement rec room for the party, furthest from Marmalade's main hiding spots. They'd keep the door to the upper floor closed. They'd warn the girls to be quiet near the laundry room and the formal living room. They'd provide him with high-value treats hidden in his safe spots beforehand. It wasn't perfect, but it was a shield. The day of the party dawned bright and unnervingly cheerful. Sarah was a bundle of nerves, flitting between decorating the basement with streamers and balloons and checking on Marmalade. He'd vanished early that morning, undoubtedly sensing the shift in the household energy. She found him in his sanctuary behind the dryer, only the faintest glint of an eye visible in the gloom. She whispered reassurances, left a few pieces of shredded chicken near the gap, and closed the laundry room door partway, hoping the muffled sounds wouldn't reach him too badly. The girls arrived in a shrieking, glittery whirlwind. The noise, level in the basement, instantly skyrocketed. Pop music, laughter, the thump of running feet. Sarah's stomach clenched. She stationed herself near the bottom of the stairs, listening intently for any sound from above. Minutes ticked by. Nothing. Then 10 minutes. Still nothing. Maybe he was just hunkered down, riding it out. She dared to hope. She was helping distribute pizza slices in the basement when she heard it, not from upstairs. From outside, a high-pitched, frantic yowling, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. It cut through the party noise like a knife. Sarah froze, a slice of pizza slipping from her fingers. Mark's head snapped up from across the room, his eyes wide with identical dread. Chloe stopped mid-laugh, her face paling. The sound came again, louder, more desperate, unmistakably Marmalade. He wasn't behind the dryer. He wasn't hiding upstairs. He was outside. Sarah was moving before the second yowl faded, shoving past startled girls, taking the basement stairs 2 at a time, Mark hot on her heels. They burst into the kitchen. The back door, the door leading to the screened-in porch and then the backyard, was standing wide open. One of the girls must have gone out for a moment and not latched it properly behind her. And Marmalade, driven by a terror deeper than any fear of the party noise, had bolted. They ran onto the porch. "Marmalade!" Sarah screamed, her voice raw with panic. The bright afternoon sun felt harsh, mocking. The backyard stretched before them. Familiar bushes, the swing set, the fence line. Empty, silent. The desperate yowling had stopped. He was gone, again. Vanished into the vast, terrifying world he'd only just escaped. The fragile trust, the tentative purr, the microscopic progress, obliterated in an instant by an unlatched door and the overwhelming echo of 3 lost years. The carefully constructed shield had shattered. The mystery of his trauma had just exploded into a full-blown crisis. The party's cheerful noise from below felt like a cruel taunt. The search, the agonizing, hollow search, had begun anew, right in their own backyard. The cliffhanger wasn't a question of if he'd be found, but how broken he'd be when they did, or if they'd find him at all this time. The world outside the door had reclaimed him. Every new subscriber is like a warm cup of tea to my soul. It keeps this little channel going. If you felt that lurch in your chest when Marmalade bolted, I'd love for you to stay. The silence after Marmalade's terrified yowl was worse than the sound itself. It was a void, a sucking vacuum where hope had been seconds before. Sarah stood frozen on the back porch, the cheerful shrieks of the birthday party echoing grotesquely from the basement below, a soundtrack of normalcy that felt like a cruel joke. The bright afternoon sun beat down, highlighting every blade of grass, every leaf in the backyard. An achingly familiar landscape turned suddenly menacing. Empty, utterly, terrifyingly empty. The unlatched door gaped beside her, a silent accusation. Gone. He's gone again. Marms. Mark's roar ripped through the stillness, raw and desperate, shattering Sarah's paralysis. He vaulted off the porch, crashing through flower beds, scanning the fence line, peering under the deck. Marmalade here, buddy. His voice cracked. Chloe burst onto the porch behind Sarah, her face ashen, the remnants of birthday glitter sparkling incongruously on her tear-streaked cheeks. Mommy, did he run away? Her whisper was a broken thing. Because of the noise? Sarah couldn't speak. The numbness that had protected her for 3 years was gone, incinerated by the frantic weeks of rebuilding trust, replaced by a white-hot terror that seared her lungs. She saw it again, the matted fur disappearing into the bushes, the haunted eyes wide with primal flight, the echo of that lost mew at the shelter. 3 years of survival, only to lose him to an open door in his own backyard. The thought was a physical blow. She stumbled down the porch steps, her legs shaking. "Girls, quiet!" Mark bellowed towards the basement door, his voice laced with a panic that instantly silenced the party noise below. He turned back, his eyes wild, scanning the yard. "Check the bushes, the shed. Chloe, check under the deck again." They moved like frantic ghosts through their own yard. Sarah dropped to her hands and knees, crawling along the fence line, her fingers scrabbling through damp earth and prickly holly bushes, calling his name in a voice choked with tears. "Marmy? Sweet boy? Please, please come out. It's safe. It's safe now." The scent of overturned earth, crushed mint from the herb garden, and the faint, lingering ozone from the morning rain filled her nostrils. But underneath it, she strained for the musky tang of cat, the rasp of his breath. Nothing. Only the frantic pounding of her own heart. Mark wrenched open the garden shed door. Empty except for rakes and bags of mulch. He checked the crawl space vents. Nothing. Chloe, her small body trembling, peered under the deck again, her voice a tiny, terrified warble. "Marmy? It's me, Chloe, please?" The minutes stretched thin and agonizing. Every rustle of leaves in the breeze was his phantom movement. Every shadow beneath a rhododendron held his shape. The familiar yard became a labyrinth of dread. Sarah's mind raced, painting horrific scenarios. Him scaling the fence into the neighbor's yard with their boisterous Labrador, bolting blindly into the busy street beyond the front of the house, vanishing into the network of storm drains that ran beneath the neighborhood. The same drain she'd imagined him sheltering in during those lost years. The fragility of his trust, the tentative purr from just last night, obliterated. They hadn't just lost him. They'd shattered the painstakingly rebuilt bridge back to himself. He'll never trust us again. He'll think we betrayed him, like the world did before. The guilt was suffocating. "Call the neighbors," Mark gasped, pulling out his phone, his hand shaking so badly he fumbled the passcode. "The ones behind. Tell them to check their yards. Warn them he's terrified." Sarah fumbled for her own phone, her vision blurring with tears. She dialed the Johnsons behind them, then the Millers to the left, her voice a shaky, incoherent plea. "Our cat, Ginger, just got out, terrified. Please, if you see him." Each call felt futile. Marmalade was a shadow, a whisper. He could be blocks away by now, driven by pure, mindless panic. Chloe ran back onto the porch, her breath coming in hitches. He liked the laundry room, she stammered, tears streaming. And the garage door. Maybe he went to the front? To the garage? The garage. The place he'd stared at with such profound longing and confusion. The threshold he'd investigated when Sarah cracked it open. Was it possible? In his blind terror, had instinct driven him towards the last place that held some ambiguous sense of familiarity, however painful? Sarah exchanged a desperate glance with Mark. It was a thread, thin as spider silk, but they seized it. They ran through the house, bursting out the front door into the driveway. The suburban street was quiet under the afternoon sun. Empty sidewalks, parked cars, no flash of orange. Sarah's gaze swept the driveway, the garage door, the bushes flanking the house. Nothing. Her shoulders slumped. Then Mark froze. He held up a hand, silencing her ragged breathing. "Listen," he hissed. Sarah strained. At first nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, carried on the slight breeze, a low, continuous guttural yowling. Not the frantic shriek from the backyard. This was deeper, more desperate, a sound of pure, trapped anguish. It seemed to be coming from underneath. "The car," Mark breathed, his eyes wide with dawning horror. He dropped to his knees beside Sarah's sedan parked in the driveway, peering frantically into the dark space beneath the chassis. "Marmalade? Buddy?" The yowling intensified, a raw scrape of sound. Sarah dropped beside him, pressing her cheek to the sun-warmed asphalt. In the gloom beneath the car, she saw 2 points of reflected light, his eyes wide and insane with fear. He was pressed flat against the driveway, wedged somehow near the front tire, his body a rigid, trembling line. The sound vibrating from him was primal, the sound of an animal convinced it was about to die. "Oh God, baby," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "It's okay. We're here. We're here now." But her words were meaningless against the tsunami of his terror. He didn't recognize them. He only saw looming giants reaching into his last refuge. Mark scrambled up. "I'll get the jack. We need to lift the car." "No." Sarah grabbed his arm. "The noise, the movement, it'll terrify him more. He might bolt again right into the street." The image of him darting under a passing car was visceral, nauseating. They were trapped. He was trapped, physically and by the walls of his own trauma. Chloe crouched beside Sarah, her small face pale but set with determination. She didn't reach. She didn't call his name loudly. She lay flat on her stomach on the driveway, mirroring Sarah's position, her face near the edge of the car, and she started to hum, softly, tunelessly, a lullaby Sarah used to sing to her when she was very small, a melody Marmalade would have heard countless times drifting from Chloe's room during his first life with them, a familiar thread woven into the fabric of his past. The humming was soft, barely audible over his panicked yowls. But slowly, incrementally, the frantic edge of the sound softened. The rigid trembling in his body, visible even in the shadows, lessened by a fraction. His wide, terrified eyes remained fixed on them, but the primal madness in them seemed to flicker, replaced by a dawning, exhausted confusion. He knew that sound. Some deep-buried part of him knew it. Sarah joined Chloe, humming the same simple tune, her own voice thick with tears. She didn't move closer. She just hummed, pouring every ounce of love, regret, and desperate reassurance into that fragile melody. Mark knelt beside them, silent, a solid presence radiating calm he surely didn't feel. Minutes crawled by. The sun beat down on Sarah's back. The rough asphalt scraped her elbows. The smell of hot tar and engine oil filled her nose. Marmalades, yowls subsided into ragged, hitched breaths. Then silence. A watchful, trembling silence. He was still pressed flat, still terrified, but the blind panic had receded. He was seeing them now. really seeing them. Chloe, Sarah, Mark, shapes and scents that were piercingly, agonizingly familiar, cutting through the fog of terror. "Hey, Marmee," Sarah whispered, her voice a raw scrape. "It's us. Just us. We're so sorry, sweet boy. So sorry." She slowly extended her hand, palm down, fingers relaxed, stopping a full foot short of the car's edge. An offering, not a threat. He flinched violently, pressing himself even flatter, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Sarah froze. Chloe kept humming. Mark held his breath. Then the impossible. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Marmalade uncurled his front legs from where they'd been tucked beneath him. He stretched one thin, trembling foreleg out from the darkness. Not toward Sarah's hand, not yet. Just out. Testing the air. His claws tapped faintly on the asphalt. Tap. Tap. The sound was heartbreakingly familiar. The same tentative exploration he'd made on the shelter floor. He sniffed the air flowing over Sarah's outstretched hand. His nostrils flared. His gaze locked onto her fingers. Sarah didn't move, didn't breathe. Tears streamed freely down her face, dripping onto the hot driveway. The world narrowed to that space between her hand and his trembling paw. 3 years of loss, weeks of fragile hope, shattered by an open door. Could a melody and an outstretched hand rebuild it? He shifted his weight. Inch by inch he crawled forward, his body low, his movements painfully cautious. He emerged fully from beneath the car, into the harsh sunlight of the driveway. He looked pitiful. Dust and grit coated his matted fur. His sides heaved with panicked breaths. His eyes, though still wide, held less terror and more profound exhaustion. A deep, soul-weary confusion. He stopped just beyond the shadow of the car, maybe 8 inches from Sarah's hand. He stared at her fingers as if they held the answer to every horror he'd endured. Then he looked up. Not at her hand. Into her eyes. Deep into her eyes. Sarah held his gaze, pouring every ounce of her shattered heart into that look. "I see you. I know you're scared. I'm here. I won't hurt you. I love you." She didn't say the words, but she willed him to feel them. His gaze dropped back to her hand. He took one more infinitesimal step forward. His nose twitched, sniffing her skin. He knew her scent. The lotion she always used. The faint trace of laundry detergent. The unique, comforting smell of Sarah that was woven into his earliest memories. He lowered his head, slowly, tentatively, and touched his nose, cold and damp, to the very tip of her middle finger. The contact was feather-light, fleeting. He jerked back instantly, a flinch rippling through his body, his eyes darting back to hers, wary. But he didn't run. He didn't hiss. He just stood there, trembling, watching her. Sarah's breath hitched. A sob escaped, raw and ragged. She kept her hand perfectly still. An open invitation. He looked at her hand again, then back at her eyes. Something shifted in his gaze. The confusion didn't vanish, but it was joined by a flicker of recognition, not just of scent, but of her. Of the connection that had once been as solid as the earth beneath them. He took another small step. He stretched his neck out further this time. He sniffed her fingers again more deliberately. Then he did something that shattered Sarah completely. He lifted his thin, trembling right paw. Not to bat, not to scratch. Slowly, deliberately, with infinite care, he placed it gently, oh so gently, on the back of Sarah's wrist. The pads of his paws were rough, dry. His claws were sheathed. The weight was negligible, yet it felt like an anchor, grounding her to the spot. It wasn't affection, not yet. It was a question, a plea, a tentative bridge thrown across the abyss of his terror and their shared, devastating history. Is it really you? Is it safe? Sarah didn't move her hand. She didn't try to pet him. She just let the weight of his paw rest there, a fragile, sacred connection. She looked into his green eyes, still clouded with fear and exhaustion, but now holding a glimmer of something else, something profoundly vulnerable, something that remembered. It's you. she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "It's really you, Marmalade. We found you. We're here." His gaze held hers. He blinked. Slowly. Once. Then again. A slow blink of utter, bone-deep exhaustion, but also, unmistakably, a slow blink of trust, surrender, the tiniest lowering of the drawbridge. He didn't purr. He didn't rub against her. He just kept his paw resting lightly on her wrist, his body trembling less violently now, his eyes locked on hers, accepting the lifeline she offered. In that silent, sun-drenched driveway, surrounded by the echoes of a child's party and the scent of hot asphalt, Sarah finally understood the depth of his journey. It wasn't just about finding his way home physically. It was about finding his way back to the belief that home and the love it held could still exist for him. The paw on her wrist wasn't just contact. It was an answer to the silent vigil he'd kept at the garage door. It was the first, trembling step back across the threshold. The mystery of his survival wasn't solved, but the barrier of his terror had been breached, not by force but by a child's lullaby and an outstretched hand held perfectly, agonizingly still. The storm hadn't passed, but in the quiet eye of it, huddled on the driveway with her lost cat's paw on her skin, Sarah finally understood. Healing wasn't about erasing the scars. It was about learning to find home again, even when home felt like the most terrifying place of all. The emotional peak wasn't joy. It was the raw, trembling catharsis of connection reforged in the crucible of shared trauma. He was still broken. They were still broken. But they were broken together again. The journey back hadn't ended with the shelter reunion. It had only truly begun here, on the hot asphalt, with a single paw bridging the chasm. She understood now that finding him was only half the miracle. The other half was him choosing, in that moment of utter vulnerability, to be found. The world didn't magically right itself after the driveway. Marmalade didn't transform overnight into the plump, confident cat who'd vanished 3 years before. The trembling paw resting on Sarah's wrist was a beginning, not an ending. A fragile flag planted on scorched earth. They brought him inside, not with a triumphant flourish, but with the aching tenderness reserved for handling shattered glass. Mark carefully lifted him, a bundle of tense muscle and wary eyes, cradling him against his chest. Marmalade didn't struggle, didn't hiss. He simply shut his eyes, pressing his face into the fabric of Mark's shirt, a small, shuddering sigh escaping him. The terror had burned out, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound it seemed to seep into his bones. Sarah walked beside them, her hand hovering near his dusty fur, Chloe clinging to her other hand, her small face etched with a mixture of relief and lingering shock. The cheerful chaos of the party felt like a distant, dissonant dream. They bypassed the living room, the kitchen, and went straight upstairs to Sarah and Mark's bedroom, the quietest, safest space. They closed the door. The sudden hush was profound. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, painting stripes on the carpet. They placed Marmalade gently on their bed on Mark's side, where a worn, soft t-shirt lay. He didn't bolt. He didn't hide. He curled into a tight, defensive ball right there, tucking his nose under his ragged tail, his eyes slitted open, watchful, but utterly drained. Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed, her own limbs heavy with adrenaline crash. Mark leaned against the doorframe, running a trembling hand over his face. Chloe climbed cautiously onto the bed, lying down a careful foot away from Marmalade, mirroring his curled position, her stuffed ginger cat held tight. No one spoke. The only sounds were the faint hum of the house settling and Marmalade's shallow, uneven breathing. He slept. Not the deep, rumbling sleep of security, but the fitful, twitching sleep of utter depletion. His muscles jerked. Tiny whimpers escaped his closed mouth. Sarah watched him, her heart a bruised thing in her chest. The paw on her wrist had been a miracle. But the reality of the damage was laid bare in these tremors, this haunted rest. The scars weren't just physical. The ragged ear, the visible ribs under his slowly improving coat. The deepest wounds were etched into his nervous system, a map of 3 years spent in survival mode. The open door hadn't just been a mistake. It had ripped open barely healed psychic scars, flooding him with the terror of being lost and alone, all over again. Life moved forward, but the axis had shifted. The party ended, the girls departing with whispered goodbyes and concerned glances. The house regained its quiet rhythms, but they were rhythms rewritten around Marmalade's fragile state. The basement rec room became the designated loud zone for Chloe's games or movie nights. Doors were checked and double-checked. Latches clicked with deliberate finality. Sudden movements were softened. Voices were kept low, especially in the mornings when Marmalade seemed most vulnerable. Sarah found herself moving through her own home like a ghost, hyper-aware of every creak of the floorboard, every clatter of a dish, anticipating the flinch, the wide-eyed stare, the potential bolt for cover. Yet within this careful scaffolding, tiny miracles bloomed. He began using the fleece bed under the bookshelf regularly, not just at night. He'd curl there in the afternoons watching the play of light through the bay window, his body gradually unclenching, the watchfulness softening into observation. He started eating during the day, venturing into the kitchen while Sarah washed dishes or Mark made coffee, keeping a wary distance but no longer vanishing at the sound of a cabinet closing. He discovered the sunbeam that hit the living room rug at precisely 10:30 a.m. and claimed it as his own, stretching out with a tentative sigh, the tight coil of his body loosening incrementally under the warmth. The garage door vigil continued, but it changed. He still sat before it, sometimes for long stretches, but the intense, desperate staring softened. It became more contemplative, less a plea, more a remembrance. Once, Sarah found him sitting there, not staring at the door, but washing his face with slow, deliberate strokes of his paw, as if performing a ritual of grounding. He'd glance at the door, then continue his bath, a quiet acceptance settling over him. The mystery hadn't vanished, but its sharp edges were blurring, absorbed into the slow current of healing. Chloe remained his steadfast anchor. She'd sit cross-legged on the floor near his sunbeam spot, reading aloud from her chapter books in that soft, steady monotone that seemed to soothe him. She started drawing him. Page after page in her sketchbook, Marmalade curled in his fleece bed, Marmalade watching birds from the window. They kept it cracked open now with a secure screen. Marmalade with his head tilted in that old, familiar way. She drew him before the garage door, too, but in these pictures he looked thoughtful, not scared. One afternoon, she left her sketchbook open on the coffee table. Sarah glanced at it. There was a drawing of Marmalade sitting in the driveway, sunlight. A small, hesitant paw extended towards a large, gentle hand. Underneath, in Chloe's careful printing, it said, "He remembered." The purr returned. Not the fragile, stuttering vibration of that first night, but a deeper, more consistent rumble. It started tentatively, when Chloe stroked him very gently while he was deeply relaxed in his sunbeam, just one finger tracing the fur between his ears. It was a risk. They'd avoided direct touch, letting him initiate. But Chloe's touch was feather-light, her intent pure calm. He stiffened for a fraction of a second, then the rumble began. Low, hesitant, then stronger, vibrating up her finger. Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes as she watched from the doorway. Chloe beamed, a silent, radiant smile. It was a sound they'd thought lost forever, a primal language of contentment relearned. Touch became their slow, sacred language. Marmalade began initiating it. He'd brush against Sarah's leg as she stood at the kitchen counter. A fleeting, deliberate touch, then dart away, watching her reaction. He'd hop onto the sofa while they watched TV, settling not on their laps but beside them, close enough that his fur just touched their legs, radiating warmth. He'd press the top of his head against Mark's hand when Mark reached down slowly to offer a quiet greeting. Each touch was a gift, a hard-won token of trust deposited into the fragile account of their bond. Sarah learned the texture of his fur again, still slightly coarse in places from his ordeal, but slowly regaining its old softness underneath. She learned the exact pressure he tolerated, the spots he liked, base of the ears gently, the ones he still flinched from, his back near the tail. His body, once a fortress, became a landscape they learned to navigate with reverence. The haunted look in his eyes never completely vanished. There were still moments, a dropped book, a doorbell ringing unexpectedly, the rumble of thunder, that sent him bolting for the safety behind the dryer or under their bed, his eyes wide with the ghosts of his past. But the recovery time shortened. He'd emerge sooner, his trembling less violent, his return to the sunbeam or the fleece bed more decisive. He was learning that the monsters weren't always at the door, that safety could be regained. Months bled into seasons. The sharp chill of late autumn softened into the gentle gray drizzle of early spring. The world outside began to green. One rainy Saturday afternoon, the kind that makes the house feel like a cozy cocoon, Sarah was curled on the sofa reading. Mark was tinkering with the loose drain pipe in the garage, finally fixed. Chloe was sprawled on the rug, drawing. Marmalade was in his fleece bed under the bookshelf, a soft, steady purr emanating from him like the hum of a contented engine. Rain drummed a soothing rhythm on the roof and windows. Sarah looked up from her book, her gaze drifting naturally to Marmalade. He was stretched out on his side, utterly relaxed, one paw dangling over the edge of the bed. His eyes were closed, his breathing deep and even. The deep lines of tension that had been etched around his eyes and mouth for months were smooth. He looked peaceful, not just resting, but profoundly safe. The sight was a balm. It was the culmination of 1,000 tiny acts of patience, 1,000 moments of choosing quiet, 1,000 offerings of safety held out with open hands. He wasn't the cat he'd been. He was a cat who had been lost, profoundly broken, and had somehow, miraculously, found his way not just home, but back to a version of himself that could feel peace. Chloe looked up from her drawing, following Sarah's gaze. A soft smile touched her lips. She carefully put her pencils down and crawled quietly over to the fleece bed. She didn't reach out to touch him. She simply sat beside it, cross-legged, watching him sleep. Her expression, one of pure, quiet love. Marmalade didn't stir. His purr deepened slightly, a subconscious response to her familiar presence. Sarah felt a swell of warmth so profound it ached. This was the resolution. Not a fanfare, but this quiet symphony of rain, purring, and the soft scratch of Mark's tools from the garage. It was the ordinary made extraordinary by the sheer improbability of its existence. The hole in their lives wasn't gone. It was simply filled now, not with the ghost of what was lost, but with the living, breathing, purring reality of what had been regained, scars and all. Later that evening, after Chloe was asleep and the house was quiet, Sarah walked into the kitchen to make tea. Mark was putting away the last of the tools in the garage. As she filled the kettle, a flicker of movement near the back door caught her eye. Marmalade was there, not sitting vigil, not staring out. He was crouched low, his tail tip twitching, his gaze fixed intently on something on the floor near the doormat. Sarah moved closer slowly. There, illuminated by the soft glow of the undercabinet, light was a large, slightly crumpled crane fly that had somehow found its way inside, struggling weakly on the tile. Marmalade's focus was absolute. Not the frantic, predatory pounce of his youth, but a focused, almost gentle concentration. He crept forward, silent as smoke, his body low. He extended one paw, not to bat it violently, but to tap it lightly, curiously, with a single sheathed claw. The insect fluttered weakly. Marmalade watched, his head tilted slightly. He tapped it again, even softer. Then, instead of the final, fatal swipe Sarah expected, he did something astonishing. He carefully nudged the crane fly with his nose, not hard, just a soft push, guiding it towards the small gap under the back door where the damp night air seeped in. He nudged it again, patiently, until the insect managed to flap its crumpled wing once, twice, and then weakly scrambled under the door and out into the rainy night. Marmalade sat back on his haunches. He watched the gap under the door for a long moment, his ears pricked forward. Then he turned. He looked directly at Sarah, who stood frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding. His green eyes, in the dim light, held an expression she couldn't quite name. Not triumph, not curiosity satisfied. It looked like quiet understanding, a profound, simple acknowledgement. It needed to go out. So I helped it go out. He blinked at her slowly, a deep, deliberate, contented blink. Then he turned and padded, silently past her, heading towards the living room and his fleece bed. His tail held high, not in defiance, but in a quiet, unassuming balance. Sarah stood alone in the kitchen, the only sound the gentle hiss of the kettle starting to boil in the drumming rain outside. Tears welled, hot and silent. This was the final gift. Not a grand gesture, but this small, unexpected act of empathy from a creature who had known so little of it himself. He had seen something trapped, something lost and struggling, and instead of destruction, he had chosen release. He had chosen kindness. In guiding that fragile, broken insect back to its own world, Marmalade had silently declared his own return, not just to safety, but to the essence of who he had always been beneath the layers of trauma, a creature capable of gentleness. It was a testament to the resilience of his spirit, a quiet echo of the paw placed on her wrist in the driveway, a gesture of connection, of understanding, of choosing the better path even when the world had shown him its claws. He wasn't just home. He was whole again, in the ways that mattered most. The lost years hadn't destroyed his core. They had buried it, and he had dug it out, one tentative paw tap at a time. Sarah poured her tea, the warmth of the mug seeping into her hands. She carried it into the living room. Marmalade was already curled in his fleece bed, a soft, steady purr rumbling through the quiet room. She sat on the sofa nearby, not disturbing him, just sharing the space. The rain whispered against the windows. The loose drain pipe was silent. The house felt settled, complete. She looked at Marmalade, this miracle of matted fur and mended trust, and understood the deepest truth the long, painful journey had etched onto her heart. Love isn't about erasing the scars of the past. It's not about returning things to how they were. It's about creating a new kind of safe, a sanctuary where the scars can exist without defining you. It's about showing up, day after day, with quiet patience and open hands, offering a place where even the most broken creature can remember how to purr. It's about believing in the possibility of return, even when every shadow whispers otherwise. And sometimes, the greatest proof of healing isn't a fanfare, but the quiet act of setting something else free. Marmalade had found his way home, and in doing so he had taught them that home isn't just a place you find, but a piece you rebuild together, one gentle nudge at a time. Against all odds, you stayed till the end, thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.